We continue then with our story of the book of Ruth, this little narrative that we see nestled after the book of Judges, but prior to the monarchy outlined in 1 Samuel. And let me remind you again that the central character of this book is Naomi. All right, she is the central character. The book is built around her. She's the main character of the story. But Ruth is the focal character of the story. Now, that sounds like a contradiction, but it's really not. The story is written about Naomi and the issues of her, but Ruth becomes the focal character in the story, thus the reason it's named for her. And there's a number of reasons why, but there's three specific events that occur in the course of the book which make her, raise her up to the level of being the focal point. First, of course, at the very end of the book, as she becomes the mother of the child that becomes the ancestor of David, that puts her in a position of honor. And so she's raised to this focal level. We see it also in chapter 3 in her dealings with Boaz, as she will come to this Boaz and seek him out in the great relationship that she develops with him. That will become a part of it as well. It will raise her up to this focal point. But probably the most prominent one of all is what we're going to start looking at this morning, starting in verse 15. Her response to Naomi, as we see it in these verses, particularly in verses 15 to 18. Her response here is what really sets her out as the one that becomes the focus, if you will. So Naomi is the character to which the story is written, but Ruth becomes the focus along the way. And it's this particular great statement, or exclamation I prefer to call it, that really makes her stand out. So what we see now, coming to verse 15 then, is the story turning to her, in the sense of her now becoming the focus, because specifically of what she says to her mother-in-law. However, to properly engage the rest of this chapter, it is better for us to work from the end of it backwards. So in other words, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this chapter exactly upside down and look at it in reverse order, if you will, chronologically, okay? And I think for two reasons. It's better for us to continue first with the reaction of Naomi to her circumstances, which we already saw started in the previous lesson. So Naomi has already been speaking to her daughters-in-law about her situation and her understanding of it, her reaction to it, and she will continue that, but later, after Ruth's statement. So I want to pick up and continue with what she says. And another reason, of course, is because I want to end this sermon on the positive note of Ruth's great statement of faith, than to end it with Naomi's whining about her circumstances, okay? In other words, the last thing I want to leave you with is Naomi whining. I want to leave us with Ruth's great exclamation, okay? So we'll start by continuing the storyline, what's happening in the narrative. Then we'll finish Naomi's view of her situation, completing her words from last week, and then we'll look at Ruth's great exclamation. Now, let's just talk about the details of the story first. We already know, of course, that at this particular point that Elimelech and his two sons have died. They're living in Moab. Naomi and her two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, have been widowed at this point. And Naomi has already decided that she wants to return to Israel, and she's decided that her circumstances in Moab are dire. She is convinced that returning to Israel is her only possibility of survival, and that's probably true given the fact that she's living in a foreign land as a foreigner, now without any sort of male support. She's really has very little that she can find, so hopefully she can find some kindness in Israel from some relatives there that will show her kindness so that she can survive. And as we noticed last week, she's convinced that Orpah and Ruth cannot benefit from following her. She makes this argument. Listen, if you follow me, girls, you're going to wind up being foreigners yourself in a foreign land, because you're both Moabites, and therefore if you go to Israel, you're now going to be foreigners in a foreign land. I, Naomi, cannot provide for you financially, and I certainly can't give you husbands. I don't have one. And even if I found one today, it would be a number of years before I would be able to have sons old enough for you to marry and then continue the family. So that's not going to happen. So you'd be better off remaining here in Moab. Go back to your mother's house, find comfort amongst your own family, and seek out a husband from here. So as we get to the end of the previous chapter, or previous section, I should say, verse 14, Orpah and Ruth make different choices. Orpah listens to her mother-in-law and decides to stay in Moab. Of the two girls, Orpah decides to remain behind. Now, I just want to pause here for a moment and discourage you from looking down upon Orpah's decision. The natural way of reflecting upon this will say, well, how come she didn't have the faith of Ruth and go with Ruth as well? I mean, okay, so this girl should be, written off. I don't think so. Look, all of what Naomi said is reasonable. All of what I just outlined that Naomi argued is reasonable, okay? Try to put yourself in a second millennium BC environment. I know it's hard. That's 3,000 years ago. It's hard to put yourself into that kind of situation in a purely agrarian, ancient society. Everything that Naomi said is true. It's not a faulty argument that Naomi made. It's really kind of true. And then secondly, although Naomi may have introduced Orpah to Yahweh, the God of Israel, there should be no assumption here that Yahweh has introduced himself to her. Okay? It certainly is true that Naomi has given to her daughter-in-law some sense of this God. Obviously, the faith of Ruth is clear, but it should not be construed as though the faith that Ruth had should automatically be in Orpah. In fact, it is the uniqueness of Ruth's faith that makes her the focal character of this story. So the essence is that when we look at what Orpah does, we should see it as reasonable. Let me add one point to that. Naomi's quite persuasive here. Naomi's quite persuasive here because the way she speaks of her God would dissuade anybody from believing in that God. In all fairness, she's not talking positively about Yahweh here. And so for Orpah to come to that place where she would look upon her mother-in-law's faith, or lack thereof, and make a decision to stay with her is obviously illogical. So I'm encouraging you not to look down upon Orpah's choices. She's making a reasonable, logical, dare I say even consistent choice with the world in which she lived. Ruth is making an extraordinary kind of connection. But Orpah's making a reasonable one. Reasonable and logical for a woman in her place to do at that time. So Orpah goes back to her mother. Now, if you look at verse 19 and 22, all right, like I said, I'm going to start at the end and work backwards. 19 says, so the two of them, that is Naomi and Ruth, went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women said, is this Naomi? Look at also verse 22. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. All right. So the two verses are designed to give us the continuing narrative of the story. The story is being outlined now with the facts of these two women going back to Bethlehem, and they arrive at the barley harvest. They arrive at the time when the harvest of the barley would be taking place. Now, you'll notice that she returns to her original town. She goes back to Bethlehem, back to the place from which Elimelech took her originally 10 years ago. And the reason for doing that would be any chance of finding help would be from relatives and friends there. It would make no sense to just randomly pick a spot in Judah and land there in the hope that somebody would help. If you're going back to get help from someone, where are you going to go? You're going to go to the place where there's family, there's help. I mean, that's why so many college students go home after college, because, that's where you're going to find help, right? Makes reasonable sense. The timing is also significant. I mentioned this last week, that the barley harvest is underway. But part of the reason for Naomi to go back is, I want you to think about this for a moment. When would the people in that place be the most generous? It would be at the time of the harvest, wouldn't it? I mean, it's very much the reason why the Salvation Army puts bell ringers outside of Walmart at Christmas time. Okay? They don't do it in June. They do it in December. Why? Because they know that's when people are most generous. That's when they have that Christmas spirit, and they just feel like, yes, now I'm willing to give. When if you walked past one of those people in July, it'd be like, you're just annoying. Why are you here? You see, so she goes back at a time in which she knows the people will be most generous. So I think the timing is important. I think that's the reason why the writer includes that little detail, because he wants to make sure that you understand how this story unfolds. Now, yes, the barley harvest will be relevant to what Ruth does next, and we'll see that when we get into the next chapter. But there's also a sense of timing involved in why Naomi goes back to this point. So the story then, in the literal sense, is simply now that Naomi and Ruth have returned to Israel. Or better, Naomi has returned to Israel, and Ruth is barnacled to her leg. Now, verses 20 and 21. Working backwards again, as I said. Naomi arrives in this place, and in verse 20, in verse 19 it says, the whole town is stirred because of them. The whole town is stirred because of them. Now, just picture for a moment the questions that would arise when this former member of the community returns. Again, don't forget, this is 10 years later, okay? 10 years later, and an entirely different kind of situation. The first question, of course, is, well, who is this woman? You see it actually at the very end of the verse. Is this Naomi? I mean, we remember a woman by the name of Naomi, but is this really her? Is this really the woman? Why has she returned after 10 years? Sounds like they had moved to Moab and stayed there. The famine was over long ago that they fled from, but now she's back. And where is her husbands and her sons? Why has she come back alone? Why has she come back without any male support? What happened in that situation? And then I think probably the most important question that really should be asked at this point is, who is this Moabite girl barnacled to her leg? Who is this girl? And why is she here? What's the point of her being here in this place? In other words, the stir may be questioning the motives of Naomi. Why is she here? What exactly is she hoping to accomplish here? Why has she returned? And why has she brought a Moabite girl with her in all of this? Or some subordinate questions that we can infer. Why did you leave Israel for Moab in the first place? And why did you stay there so long? Why only now are you coming back? And why do you think that you can come back here now and expect our support? What makes you think that you can come back here and we're just going to embrace you into the family life of Israel? I am convinced that the nature of Naomi's response, see below, is designed to elicit sympathy. Put yourself in the situation. You show back up in a place you haven't been in 10 years. Your life is completely different. You're carrying with you a girl who's a foreigner, and you show up in this place expecting, by clear implication, to be supported. What's the natural question that everybody's going to ask? Why are you here? What do you want from us? And I think that Naomi's response is designed to elicit sympathy from the people of the town in order that they will support her, that they will take her in and feed her and clothe her and shelter her, because she has nothing else to appeal with, right? I mean, she's not bringing anything with her that would become naturally something that the village needs. In reality, she's just another mouth to feed. Oh, and it's two mouths, not just one. So I think her response is designed to elicit sympathy. So here's what Naomi says to the people of the town. Listen to this. Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Now, let me just pause for a moment with a little parenthesis here. In ancient Israelite culture, well, not even ancient Israelite culture, even to the times of Christ, names of people and places often came to be associated with their character. Names of people and places often came to be associated with their character. Okay, I was thinking through the Old Testament, trying to think of a good example. The best one I could come up with is Jacob. Okay, I know there's many others, but Jacob's the one that sort of stands out. The word Jacob came to mean over time, he takes by the heel, or he cheats. Jacob became a word which meant he takes by the heel. And you remember, it comes out of the story of his birth in Genesis 25. Where he grabs a hold of his brother's ankle on the way out, right? So he's in there. But it's also a metaphorical sense in which Jacob spends his whole life cheating. Cheated his brother out of his birthright. He cheated his brother out of the blessing. He tried to cheat Laban. Didn't work, but nonetheless he tried. In other words, there was all this sense in which the actual character became the name. And so future generations, whenever they would say the word Jacob, they would conjure up the concept of he cheats. But you remember that God changed his name, remember? Purposely. And you remember when he did that. It's in Genesis chapter 32 when Jacob wrestles with God. Literally wrestles with God. Now I'm convinced that the second person of the Trinity entered in theophonic form it's a hard word to say, theophonic form, in order to come and literally wrestle with Jacob, even to the point of laming him at a spot. And then that's when God changes his name into a word which came to mean strives with God. So Israel, the entire nation, became known as a nation that strives with God. Now, strives can be positive and negative. Strives in the sense of walks with God and has relationship to God, because that's what Israel was, right? A nation, the only nation on the planet that had a direct and intimate relationship with the Creator. And yet at the same time, it's a pretty good word to describe the relationship that those people had with God over the course of that history, recounted from Joshua to Malachi and beyond. They were constantly struggling with God, wrestling with God, right? Yes, they were told what they were supposed to do, and yes, they agreed to do it, and then what did they do? Well, we don't really want to do that. They strove with God in the sense that they had a relationship with God that was often negative in striving, not just positive. And so notice how names came to be used as reflections of character. So even in these days, now we're talking 1,000 years before Christ here, here's a woman who recognizes that, who understands that it's part of the cultural milieu of the time, of someone who says, listen, I was known as Naomi, which means pleasant, but now I want you to call me Mara, which means bitter. And by the way, I know that it means bitter because the same word is used in Exodus 15. When the people of Israel come out from Egypt, they cross the Red Sea, and one of the first things they will need in this desert place that God leads them to is water. And the first place that they come to is a place where the water is bitter. And they call the place Mara. So we know this name. And so Naomi probably does as well. I'm convinced that she's quite literally lifting this name out of Genesis 15. Well, that's what the water was there. It was bitter. So I'm taking that now. Naomi originally meant, or may have come to mean, pleasant. She believed that her life when she left Israel was pleasant and comfortable. Now, dare I say, in spite of the error of her husband to leave. But now she asked the town to call her bitter. Call me bitter. You remember that Moses made the water in that place drinkable by throwing a log into it. In a metaphorical sense, that's similar to what's going on here. The log is Ruth. Naomi now recounts how God, and by the way, you'll notice twice she calls him the Almighty, has embittered her. Now, if there's nothing you get from these words, get this. From Naomi's point of view, it's God's fault. Okay? No mention of any error on her part. No mention of any error on her husband's part. No mention of any circumstances other than what God has purposed for her. She went away from Bethlehem full. She had a family. She had sons with the potential of wives and children, which, remember, in that society would have been all that you'd been looking forward to. But now she comes back empty. She's a widow. She has nothing. By the way, she says, I used to be full, and I find it somewhat limited view. There's somewhat limited view here. Her family fled Israel to escape a famine. Hardly full, right? Hardly full when she left. And another limited view is that she has returned with Ruth, a loyal and faithful daughter-in-law. You can almost imagine Ruth standing next to her when she says this and goes, excuse me, am I just chopped liver here or what? A chopped liver would have been a good thing, by the way, in that time. So, am I just something evil? She says, the Lord has testified against me. Now that word testified here means that he has literally spoken negatively about me. He has rejected me by voice. He has literally said, I don't want you anymore. That's what this idea of he has testified against me means. But here's the thing. We know from the story that in fact God has spoken positively about her. See, her limited view is such that she can only see the negative, but she doesn't see about the fact that God has actually spoken positively towards her in bringing her back to Israel and establishing a future for her. Remember, she saw none in Moab. There was no future in Moab. That's why she had to go back. She returned to Israel in the faint hope that someone would help her. We know, looking back upon it, that this is God ordaining good for her. This is God speaking forth. So her limited view is, I don't see anything but negativity in the midst of this situation. She also says the Lord has brought calamity upon her. That the Lord has ordained only difficulty and suffering. And again, she is convinced, again, notice the limited view, she's convinced that her circumstances are nothing more than evil, rather than an opportunity to trust in the Lord to bring good out of evil. And by the way, the statement of Ruth that we're going to look at in a minute utterly contradicts what she says here. Now let me ask you a question just for a moment here. Who in their right mind would want to have anything to do with a person who walks in and says, just call me bitter? Just call me bitter. Who in the world, who in their right mind would ever want to have anything to do with such a person? Have you ever met someone whose outlook isn't the cup is half empty, but the cup is empty? You ever met such a person? You ever met such a person? How many friends do they have? They have a lot of friends? Typically not. The person who walks around with that sense of a cloud over their head all the time, the whole Charlie Brown experience, is generally without friends. So here's a woman walking back into a town expecting the people to help her, and her way of getting that is to go, woe is me. See, this is why I think she's eliciting sympathy. What she's doing here is trying to get these people to go, oh, look how sad her situation is. Let's help her. Look how horrible her situation is. Let's help her. You know, she left with everything. She comes back with nothing. Well, then let's take her in. She's attempting to elicit sympathy in the midst of her circumstances. Naomi's response to her circumstances, now look back at the words that she says, is absolute self-centeredness. It's all about me. It's all about me. Her anger, her jealousy, her lack of hope, her lack of faith, her bitterness are all born out of an utterly inward turn of focus. Oh, woe is me. How awful my life is. But this self-centeredness is what leads to these things: anger, jealousy, lack of hope, lack of faith. And so, at the risk of sounding redundant, let me say again what needs to be said. And I'm going to say it a little differently than I said it last week, because last week I came this close to actually saying something, so let me actually just say something, all right? It is utterly sinful as followers of Christ to become bitter over our circumstances, okay? It's not just poor choices. It's sinful in the eyes of Almighty God to become bitter over our circumstances if we are indeed a follower of Christ. It is basically to say to the world, I am the arbiter of my own destiny. It is an inward turn of such self-centeredness and such self-focus that we quite literally go out throughout the world saying, I am the one that determines my destiny, when in fact, as followers of Christ, we recognize that we have never been the arbiters of our own destiny. That the only reason that we know this Christ is because God chose by His grace to intervene, which He shouldn't have done if He indeed is holy. You see, the true Christian steps back and goes, now wait a minute. Yes, the Lord has ordained difficult circumstances. Jesus Himself said, in this life you will have trouble, right? But take heart, I've overcome the world. You're not going to escape trouble, okay? But the goal is to look at this trouble and to recognize something. A couple of things. Number one, we must ultimately, as followers of Christ, as those who have been redeemed by this Christ, recognize that it is through evil that God has redeemed us. Listen. Nothing that you have ever experienced, no matter how difficult it is, comes anywhere close to what the Son of God experienced in His crucifixion and death. You can't even imagine the suffering of Christ. We cannot even imagine, we cannot fathom what the eternal Son of God experienced by robing Himself in flesh and being beaten and crucified, and to die. You have no idea. None whatsoever. And so we should be the first to stand up and say, wait a minute. The evil that befell Jesus is infinitely more painful than any circumstance that we've ever faced. Thus, our response should never be to assume that our situation cannot be turned to good by God. Not that God will necessarily remove the difficulty, but rather use the difficulty, as we pointed out last week, to discipline us, to train us, to grow us up into the image of this Christ that we serve. It is utterly self-centered for us to look at our circumstances and whine about them. And dare I say, it is sinful for us to do so. And then, of course, going beyond that, we must remember that God is sovereign over everything. Listen, there are no random events in life. There are no random events. There's far too many Christians running around thinking that everything is random and that God simply uses random circumstances. God is the sovereign one who has, according to His divine decree, ordained all that will be in this world, including every single thing that's happening to you in your life. And our response to this is what matters. God has decreed all that will be for a purpose. There is no evil that has befallen you or anyone else that God hasn't purposed. Thus, our reaction to evil is to say, what, O Lord, are you doing? The Lord gives life. The Lord takes life. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That should be our response. But there's far too many of us that are like Naomi. We walk around with a cloud over our head. Oh, you don't know what's happened to me, preacher. You don't have any idea what's happened in my life. Oh, if you only knew the difficulties that I have, if you only understood the pain that I've had in my life and all of the results, and my response to you would be, it ain't nothing compared to what Christ has experienced, so get over it. Look to this Jesus, the one who experienced what you will never experience. And he will be your comfort, and he will be your strength, and he will be your source of hope in the midst of your situation. There are no random events. There's purpose behind everything, which is what leads us then to the great statement of Ruth. By the way, the reason I went backwards here is because I want to set that as the backdrop to what Ruth will then say, okay? But before we look at her words themselves, let me ask you this question. What exactly would support this great statement of faith from this woman? Remember, she's not an Israelite. She is a Moabite. She has never lived in Israel. She has scant understanding of Yahweh at this time and in this place. Now, let's not forget that this is a very early period in the revelation of God into the world. In 3,000 years ago, in about 1100 BC, the only scriptures that have been written at this point is the Torah, the first 5 books of Scripture. It is highly unlikely the book of Judges has even been written at this point, even though the people are experiencing this period of time. That will come later. The Moabites, as a people and individually, have not received any revelation from God. God never came down to the Moabites and met with them and called them to himself and said, here's a law, will you do this? I'll make a covenant with you if you'll make a covenant with me, and we'll have a relationship. Nothing like that. Nothing like that ever occurred in Moab. And something else to keep in mind, Israel has been spread through the central hill country of Canaan. They have been boxed in as a people because, well, frankly, they were quite poor at the job that God had given them to go and eradicate the various peoples, natives, from Canaan. And so they had been boxed into the hill country. And the reason I point that out is because even in Israel, regular worship and teaching of the law is virtually absent at this time. There's no temple. There's no regular synagogue system. A man living in the middle of Ephraim, in the hill country of Israel, would not regularly go to the tabernacle, wherever it is at this time, and worship. It's highly unlikely. There's no rabbinical system teaching them the things of God. There's no training going on in Israel at this point. The priests are scattered, and they're doing a little bit of that, but there's not a lot of it. I mean, don't read ancient Israel through the lens of what we have today, okay? It's not the same. There's a very real, different world there. In other words, the point being that the outflow of the revelation of God and who he is and all that he has not spread at all at this point. And on top of that, according to the very last verse of the previous book in your Bible, everyone does what is right in their own eyes, meaning it is a time of spiritual anarchy. Spiritual anarchy, not just physical anarchy, but spiritual anarchy, chaos, if you will, spiritually, with very little maturity from which to glean any sense of commitment and trust in God. You're not going to look around in that time period and see a whole lot of Israelites who have a mature understanding of their God. They're regularly worshiping Him. They're growing in their understanding of Him. It's quite the opposite of that. The picture that's painted in the book of Judges is designed to paint this downward cycle of sin and oppression to the point where you get to the end of the book and what you have is this spiritual anarchy in the land. There's no knowledge of this God. Yes, He has made Himself known. He has given them a law. He's established the priesthood and so forth. But it has not yet come to this place where there is a deep and wide understanding of this God. That's the backdrop that you need to keep in mind when you think of what this woman says. This Moabite girl. So the only way that Ruth could have had any knowledge at all of Yahweh is Naomi. The only way that she could have any knowledge at all of this God is through Naomi. But based on what I just read to you a minute ago about Naomi's response, would you not agree with me that her view of God is rather stunted? Her understanding of this God is really rather stunted. Elimelech led his family away from Israel, and they have been away amongst the pagan gods of Moab for a decade. 10 years. That's likely to have an effect upon your understanding of the things of God, as limited as it was even at that time. The paganism of the surrounding peoples in which Naomi and Elimelech had lived for a decade would certainly have had some effect upon them, don't you think? Isn't that the very reason why God said, don't go live amongst foreigners, because if you do, they're going to have impact upon you. In fact, you'll notice that even Naomi in verse 15 says to Ruth, Orpah has gone back to her gods. See it? Orpah's gone back to her gods. Orpah's gone back to the only religion that she knew. Such a length of time away from Israel would have degraded Naomi's relationship to Yahweh. However, there must be here, apparently, enough knowledge of God left in Naomi to transfer at least something to Ruth. So it is a kernel, at best, of an understanding of Yahweh, which comes into Ruth's exclamation, which is recorded in verse 16. Do not urge me, this is Ruth speaking, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. Now, you will notice that the statement starts with Ruth making her connection and commitment to Naomi. Okay? It starts with a connection to Naomi, verse 16a and 17a. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, where you live, I will lodge. Where you die, I will die. Where you're buried, I will be buried, etc. There's a commitment to Naomi. Now, I would have you notice that this is a tremendous statement of loyalty and friendship. Ruth believes in her mother-in-law. All evidence to the contrary in her personality, but nonetheless, she believes in her mother-in-law. There's something about Naomi that causes Ruth to say, I'm going to go with you. I'm committed to you. That's why I use the term barnacle, by the way, because she has committed herself to the woman, Naomi. But it ends with Ruth making her connection and commitment to the God of Naomi. You see it both in 16b and 17b. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. May the Lord do to me so, etc. This is a tremendous statement of trust in the God of Israel. What makes this statement so very significant is that it is against the backdrop of the paganism of Ruth to begin with. Again, let's not forget this. She is a child of a nation steeped in paganism. She has only known the gods of Moab and their various practices and religious activities. And so for her to say, your God will be my God, Your people will be my people. And by the way, that connection of your people and my people, that's a religious statement, not just an ethnic statement. I'm going to go and be with your people. I'm going to go be with your God. May the Lord do so to me if this doesn't happen. It's way beyond her pagan beliefs. It's a tremendous statement of faith. There's no doubt of that. But I would caution you with a big fat B-U-T right here. Although it is a tremendous statement of faith, it is a limited statement of faith in this context. All the context that I just set for you, living in Moab, having a pagan background, having a mother-in-law whose view of Yahweh is rather bitter, it is a tremendous statement of faith, but it is limited in this context. Ruth's faith is mostly a trust in the God of her mother-in-law and the Israelite people. It's not a direct trust in God. It's mediated through Naomi. You see it? Where you go, I will go. I will go and be with your God. Where you lodge, I will lodge. I will go and be with your people, etc. And so while on the one hand, it looks like Ruth is making this great, tremendous statement of faith, in fact, if you're really careful with this, it's actually more of a trust in her mother-in-law and of the people that she's going with and of the God that's behind them, which I don't have a great deal of knowledge of. Naomi doesn't have a great deal of knowledge of, and even the Israelite people don't have a great deal of knowledge. It is a trust based on a very limited understanding, and frankly, has very little substance. Now, I realize that I've just preached against most commentaries on the book of Ruth, because Ruth is pictured in many places as the greatest woman of faith that ever lived. Well, okay, yes, I agree, this is a strong statement of faith, but it's mediated through something, and it's important to keep that in mind. You got to remember the context of what's going on here. You got to remember the world in which this woman lives. It is a faith. It is faith, nonetheless, I agree. And it is considered by God to be enough, of course, as history will show, but still a very limited sense of trust in this God. Which means to me, and I would say this is like everyone, the ability to trust in God must be a work of God over and above the situation in which we find ourselves. Yes, God can make himself known to a Moabite pagan girl through a bitter mother-in-law. Yes, he can do that. And he has, as you see it here. But it must be mediated by God. Again, what I want you to think about from the story is there's nothing in the story that led you to believe that Ruth, of her own, no help of God, suddenly steps back and goes, I really want to trust in the God of the Israelites. Because it isn't there. In fact, everything is pulling in the opposite direction from that. The circumstances of her reality are such that her knowledge of Yahweh would have been mediated through this bitter woman, and it would have been very limited to the point where it would not have been natural for Ruth to just say, hey, that God sounds like a God I really want to worship. Quite the opposite, in fact, which means that the ability that she had to trust in this God, to claim this God as her own, and to follow this woman into Israel as a foreigner now, must have been brought to her by the Lord. Of course, that makes sense with our overall theology in general, doesn't it? I mean, as we read the whole Bible, we realize that no one comes to faith except by the working of the Spirit of God. None of the Old Testament saints mentioned in Hebrews 11, and by the way, she's not mentioned in that chapter, but all of the various heroes that are listed, none of them came to faith simply because one day they woke up and decided to follow Yahweh. No, God intervened in their existence. Which puts before us then this application. All right, so here's where we're going to go with this. I'm going to put before you a principle that I really want you to consider. The measure of our faith is expected to be in direct proportion to the level of what God has made known to us and we have access to from him. Let me say that again. The measure of our faith, how much faith we have, our ability to believe and follow after this God, is expected to be in direct proportion to what God has made known to us and what we have access to. Jesus said it himself in Luke 12:48. To whom much is given, much is expected. Now, this principle goes something like this. Ruth lived in a time when there was virtually no knowledge of Yahweh. Certainly none in Moab, very little in Israel, as I've argued. So her faith, as it was, is in direct proportion to what little knowledge and mediation through Naomi she had. So when you look at this statement of Ruth, you see it as it is, mediated through Naomi, as really rather simplistic and small. It's not a lot to it. Enough for her to follow after Naomi, but look, it would be just reasonable for her to do so anyways because there's nothing left for her in Moab either. So it's not this strong sense of following after God because all that she has is a limited revelation from this God. But we live in a time in which God has revealed everything about himself we need to know and all of what it takes for us to mature in that knowledge. You see the difference? The difference was that Ruth, she could make an excuse and say, you know what? There's very little knowledge of God, but I trusted in that God nonetheless, even with that tiny bit of knowledge. You and I have no such excuse. We live in a time in which God has made known everything he wants us to know about his redemptive plan. With the close of the New Testament canon, the finished work of Christ, the work of the apostles in the early church, the apocalypse of John, we have everything we need to know who this God is and what he expects of us. Therefore, there is absolutely no excuse for us not to have strong faith in this God. Or there should be absolutely no reason for any sort of bitterness in our lives whatsoever. None. Zip. That's why I used the word sinful a moment ago to describe those who are bitter. It is sinful because we have this massive revelation of God in front of us. We have the church, we have the scriptures, we have the Holy Spirit himself. He has given to us all the tools that we should be able to follow this Christ. And we have no excuse, none, zip, for remaining, as we saw last week in Hebrews 5, remaining as children in the faith. None. Yes, we look to this Ruth and we see her as a great woman of faith. We see her as one who steps out from this minuscule knowledge of Yahweh that she had to make a connection to this God and go and follow after him. Good for her. But how many of us have the same level of faith, the same kind of commitment to God? Well, you know, I'm kind of committed to God. I'll kind of follow him. I'll kind of do what I'm supposed to do. In this world, in which now, living 3,000 years later, we have massive revelation from this God. We have absolutely no excuse for bitterness in our circumstances. Our ability to trust in God by the power of his now present Spirit and ever-present Word is far beyond what Naomi had, what Ruth had in her day. So there can be no room for bitterness. No root of bitterness should ever be rising up in us, because our lives now, knowing what we know, should only be filled with hope. What should characterize the Christian more than any other thing is their hope. We look through tremendously difficult circumstances, yes, and I am not in any way minimizing the pain and difficulty that you have suffered and are suffering and will continue to suffer. I'm not minimizing that. I know that some of you are struggling through some of the worst things you can possibly imagine. Grief, pain, worry, fear, temptation, and the list goes on and on. Many of which you've never shared with anybody else because it's simply too difficult for you to deal with. But let me tell you this. Those things are only an opportunity for hope. Hope. Because this Christ is seated at the right hand of his Father. He has overcome death. He has had, what did he say? Victory over this world. There is nothing in this world that this Christ cannot have victory over. And he may never remove the difficulty that you're having, but he will turn your eyes upward to him. And as I pray regularly, listen, Lord, let us look through our difficulties and see this Christ lifted up. Let me look through the pain and see this Christ lifted up. Let me look through the struggles and the heartaches and the disappointments. And the list goes on to see this Christ. Ruth did. She had nothing upon which to base her faith. You have everything upon which to build a faith. There's no excuse for us to not know this word that the Lord has given to us and through it see hope. Faith that this Christ will in the end make everything right. In this world, maybe, but in the next, definitely.